Welcome everyone to E4L's webinar to explore the insights from our Getting Evidence Moving in Schools project, which is a 3-year investigation into the way research evidence is used in Australian schools. We've got about 400 or so registrations for the webinar this evening from a wide variety of education and other stakeholders, including educators, school leaders, education department staff, researchers, and others, both from Australia and overseas. While we're waiting for everyone to join, please introduce yourself in the chat box, enter your name, your role, and where you're joining us from. For example, my name is Danielle Toon. I'm the Co-Director of Evidence for Learning, and I'm joining you from Yugambeh Land in southeast Queensland. We'll give everyone a minute or two to join. Welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone adding their name, their role, and where they're joining us from into the chat box. It's great to have so many here. I really appreciate it. I know for a lot of you who are experiencing remote learning and lockdowns at this point in time, particularly if you're in some of the southern and eastern states of Australia, that it's hard to do this after being on Zoom all day. So really appreciate your dedication. I might get started now that we have everyone rolling in. I see quite a few familiar names. So hello to everyone. Okay, to kick us off officially, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. At Evidence for Learning, we also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. My colleague Susanna will now share a link to a little bit more about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. If you're not familiar with it, there's also some education toolkits there that you can use. So welcome again. Today's agenda is designed for you to hear from our GEMS project partners about the insights for schools from the GEMS, or Getting Evidence Moving in Schools project. Up front, I'll mention that this webinar will be recorded and all the resources we mention are available free online from the Evidence for Learning website. So without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists today, including Dr. Simon Breakspear, who's the founder of Teaching Sprints. Simon is a researcher, advisor, speaker on educational leadership policy and change. He serves as an advisor to the New South Wales Department of Education School Leadership Institute and sits on the AITSL School Leadership and Teaching Expert Standing Committee. Simon began his work in education as a high school teacher and is the founder of one of the professional learning providers involved in the GEMS project, Teaching Sprints. Dr. Peter Burrows from Ed Partnerships International has extensive experience in leading, co-designing, facilitating and evaluating pedagogical, curricular and leadership development programs for educators, schools and system leaders. He has an ongoing role as a research lead and mentor at Ed Partnerships International with a focus on curriculum and pedagogical design, coaching and educational leadership, particularly in relation to the teaching and learning of mathematics. Ed Partnerships was also a professional learning provider involved in the GEMS project. Dr. Joe Gleeson is a research fellow with the Q project in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. Joe draws from cross-sectoral professional experience in executive human resource management, business consulting, careers counselling, education and education research. Mark Rickinson is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Monash University, working with Joe. His work is also focused on understanding and improving the use of research in education. And in addition to authoring the GEMS research framework, Mark is currently leading the Monash Q project, which is a 5-year initiative with the Paul Ramsay Foundation to improve the use of research evidence in Australian schools. So Carolyn Mazereski is one of our partners at the Basto Institute of Educational Leadership and the Victorian Department of Education. After starting a career in industrial chemistry, Carolyn moved into secondary teaching in Melbourne's northwest. Many years in teaching and curriculum leadership saw her move into coaching in some of the most disadvantaged schools before moving into various roles in the Victorian Department of Education and Training. Most recently, Carolyn has spent 4 years as a learning designer at Basto, as I previously mentioned, and is currently on secondment as a student achievement manager in the southwestern Victoria region. And last but definitely not least is Kathy Wilton, who is Deputy Principal of Blaxdale Street Public School in New South Wales. It's a large primary school in southwestern suburbs of Sydney. So growing amazing teaching teams and watching the students bloom energises and invigorates her. With a particular interest in working with teachers to develop strong educational leaders, Kathy is committed to building inspiring, high-impact learning communities with students at the focus of her work. Kathy and her school were involved in the GEMS project, working with 2 of our professional learning providers. So what a fantastic panel we've got this evening. Quite an eclectic and experienced group. And without further ado, I'm going to get stuck into it so we can hear from them rather than hear just from me. Before I kind of hand the reins to our panelists, I'll give you a really quick introduction of the GEMS project. So there's a lot of goodwill in Australian schools about using research, but it isn't often used in practice, according to some of the research from our very own Associate Professor Mark Rickinson. Using research in schools, it's also a surprising under-researched topic in Australia. We don't know a lot about the conditions in which research lands in schools, how it's integrated with teaching practice, the best tools to support teachers to use research evidence in practice, and the most effective ways to engage with research evidence. So as part of GEMS, we investigated the use of research evidence to inform and improve classroom practice in schools. So we focused on academic research or studies about effective teaching strategies. So what we mean by that is things like research presented in line with academic conventions, so published in academic journals and research translated for wider audience. In this project, we didn't focus on assessment or outcomes data gathered by teachers or schools, nor action research projects conducted by educators in schools, nor research to inform education policy or school strategic decision making. That's not to say all of those things aren't worthwhile. They're an important part of policy and practice, but we were focused on academic research and its use to inform classroom practice for the purposes of this project. And so we didn't have to study things for 10 years to fit everything in. So the other point I wanted to make, and we make this in all of our evidence for learning sessions, workshops, conferences, webinars, is also to say that research isn't the be all and end all. So in our work for E4L, we encourage educators to use research evidence as a signal or a series of signposts to help guide their journey, but it's up to them using their professional discretion to map out the exact route based on their environment, experience, equipment, and everything else related to their context. So we don't believe research evidence is a one-size-fits-all prescription of what needs to happen in classrooms. So a little bit more about the project. We developed evidence-based topics on key resources in primary school literacy and numeracy, then investigated different professional learning models to build educators' capability to use the evidence on those literacy and numeracy teaching strategies. So there was 205 educators involved across 24 primary schools in New South Wales and Victoria, 3 professional learning providers, 2 of which are here tonight. The third provider was Training 24/7. Monash University designed the research framework, and the Centre for Evidence and Implementation conducted the research investigation. The Victorian Department of Education and Training via BASTO and the New South Wales Department of Education via CESI were involved in the project steering group, and the project was philanthropically funded by the Eureka Benevolent Foundation, and we thank them very much for their wonderful support. So the research investigation, the study design, I encourage everyone to ask questions about the research design when someone's presenting research to them. So it involved an observational study designed using mixed methods data collection activities, including 327 online surveys, 93 educator interviews, and 50 lesson and meeting observations. The outputs from the project are all published now. The data was collected during the 2019 school year, and yes, we were very glad that we got the data collected before COVID hit in 2020 and disrupted a lot of research projects in schools, amongst other things. So in 2020, we released the GEMS research framework. In December last year, we released the GEMS investigation paper, which is the research report and the methodology and all the detailed findings. And last month, we released a version of the findings for school leaders and those that work with them. So this is what we call an insights paper, and it's accompanied by 2 reflection tools for schools. So Susanna, my colleague, will now share in the chat links to some of those resources. Okay, so let's get into the panel discussions now. The first topic we really want to explore is meaningful research evidence use in schools. So this panel is about what does it look like in schools? When we say research use, what are we talking about? What does it look like? So it's a common misconception that in order to use research evidence in their work, an educator just needs to find the right piece of research to tell them what to do in their classroom. That elusive, excellent piece of research that will solve all the problems. But usually that perfect piece of research evidence doesn't exist. Instead, educators need to identify, understand, interpret, and apply evidence from research to their classroom practice. So this is an extract on screen from our GEMS Insights paper that talks about some of that process. So selecting focus areas of what a school wants to work on, identifying specific research to support the focus area, which is easy in some cases, more difficult in others. And then a process of understanding and using that research. So from unpacking it in a collaborative fashion to using it to inform classroom practice. So in the GEMS Insights paper, we adapted a framework from a 2018 Farley, Ripple and colleagues paper entitled Rethinking Connections Between Research and Practice in Education, a Conceptual Framework. This is how we organise the examples from the GEMS schools, the 24 schools we work with, on surface and deep use of research evidence. So now these schools often displayed multiple examples of each of these, both surface and deep. So not everyone was in the right column the whole time and not everyone was in the left column the whole time. It was a mix. So this framework can help schools reflect on knowledge, attitudes to research, processes related to systemic collection, identification and critical interpretation of research, whether there is widespread participation and collaboration in these activities across the school, and how research use is embedded as part of school decision making. So for more information, you can refer to the GEMS Insights paper or the GEMS research tool on reflecting on research evidence use. So that's my little introductory spiel for the panel. We're going to spend the next 15 minutes talking about the panelist experience of meaningful research use in schools. I'm going to kick off with Simon, who was one of our professional learning providers involved in the GEMS project. He worked with 10 schools in New South Wales. So Simon, as someone who works with many schools around Australia, in addition to the schools you work with as part of Project GEMS, what are some of your reflections on what research use looks like in schools? Do you see a difference in how various schools use research evidence to inform classroom practice?
Yeah, thanks, Danny, and good afternoon, everyone. How great it is to be joining each other, physically distant, of course, but it's great to see so many comments and points of connection in the chat bar. I guess from my side, it's been an absolutely brilliant experience being part of the GEMS project, having worked for a number of years trying to support teachers to engage meaningfully with research. There's nothing better than being able to lean in and have some external providers generate new insights about what we're doing and whether or not we're actually having the impact we're intending to have. You know, when I think about research use as a researcher myself, I get really excited about that as an end in of itself. But of course, when we think about making an impact in schools, research use isn't an end, but a means. It's a means by which we can enable busy professionals to make even better decisions in service of student learning. And so when I think about research use, I think about a school principal and her team coming together maybe around November this year, thinking about their next annual implementation plan or a school improvement plan for the coming year and making big decisions about where are they going to place their limited bandwidth and budget for organizational change. As we sort of hone in on perhaps where GEMS focused in, it wasn't so much of that school-wide research use and decision-making about school improvement, but it was about teams of teachers making decisions potentially as they plan a unit of work, what evidence could inform that work, or as they make practice decisions. I think from our side, you know, research use is only as good as whether or not it actually gets integrated within the mental models of the practitioners who are making live decisions in the course of teaching and learning. You know, we know from both research and practice that teaching is complex, it's very human, it's contextual. So research doesn't help us necessarily solve technical problems, like what should I do exactly in my year 11 biology class on a Wednesday afternoon many years ago when I was trying to do that. But it can provide for us what Stephen Higgins calls the best bets, a really good starting point for informing my own practice improvement. Danny, when I think about what I see in different schools, and I can't wait to hear Kathy's insights as the leader with real credibility leading it in a single site. I suppose in my work, I'm lucky to pick up patterns. And I'd say right now, I see some schools that are almost, everyone's in the research game now, I must say. Very few schools are not engaged in research, but there's a cluster of schools that I would say engage in sort of shiny thinking or grab hold of whatever's in the Twitter zeitgeist in the educational realm. They'll tell me things like collective efficacy, Hattie said, growth mindset, or whatever else is coming through. And hey, look, I don't think we should think poorly of that. We're on the path now that everyone's in the research game. But I think that really frustrates a lot of educators on the ground, where they can kind of tell that people in their system or people leading their school haven't really got beyond that veneer, and they're just quoting whatever everyone else is referencing. And when they say something like, so what would that research look like in practice in my context? Someone just says, oh, effect size is really high, and they're just hoping no one asks them what an effect size is. But what you are seeing in the GEM schools that we got to partner with, and I think Kathy leads one of these schools in partnership with her senior leadership team at Blaxell Street, is schools that start first with the problems they're trying to solve, and then engage meaningfully with research as an input to their own decision-making, trying to see those as the best bets. And after engaging with that research, they're not simply thinking it's a technical implementation fidelity, let's just do exactly what we just read, but really thinking about how do we take the kind of core insights from this research and how do we adaptively integrate it within what we're doing here. And I think that adaptive integration that starts to embed itself in planning and starts to embed itself literally in the mental models of our teachers, whereby even on the fly, they're starting to make real-time decisions that are informed by the research engagement they've done in their professional learning communities.
Thanks so much, Simon. Eloquent as always. And we talked a lot during the GEMS project about those mental models, and it's an interesting research question too. How do you measure whether teachers are changing their mental models and adapting things on the fly? We talked about when we were doing observations, you may not see something from the evidence in practice, but that's okay, because that teacher might have made a very explicit decision and has good reasons for not using that in practice during an observation.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I was just going to say, if you take an adaptive expertise, or as Tony Lachlan, a colleague from University of New South Wales, has just put in clinical reasoning, it's about how it informs decision making. It's not whether I see the thing I told you to do, but how that informed your decision making about whether or not you did do that, and perhaps why you made the decision not to do it at a certain time. Because you don't just understand the practice, you understand the theory about why something works under certain circumstances. And so the absence of implementing that practice might actually show you that they've deeply understood under what conditions that practice would work, and therefore they refrain from using it because they picked up the contextual cues that this is not the right time at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah Ball out of the University of Michigan has done some great work on dynamic pedagogical content knowledge. And so that, what do you need to know in the moment, and then how do you adapt that in the moment for if you're teaching fractions and a student has a certain misconception, how do you address that in the moment in a class? It's a fascinating space. Let's keep going down the school and classroom space. I'm going to ask Kathy, as a school leader, if you can talk about some of the ways you mobilise research evidence in your school. And in particular, this is one of the questions a lot of people wrote in about, is how do you make time for research use in a busy school environment and given teacher workloads?
It's always the big question, isn't it? About
I'm giving you
time.
the easy ones, Kathy.
It's the big one, time. Simon was saying that we refer to, lots of schools refer to the Hattie said. At Blaxell Street, we refer to Simon says. So we've got a culture of really rigorous thinking around what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And I think that what underpins our work is primarily planning. And that helps us manage our time. It makes us accountable to our time, accountable to each other, and accountable to our work. I think when Simon alluded to external providers as being able to share insights that weren't necessarily visible to us, I think our starting point is always for Blaxell Street within our own system, within our own evidence, and looking at our own evidence is where we start. So we may look at system priorities, we look at student learning data, we look at our professional learning plans. So we know we've got a really good picture of where we're at. We get that clarity of what we need to do, and we get that clarity of how we're going to move towards that. And that's part of that really big plan that we've got. So we need to plan for success. When we're planning for success, we're looking at setting up school routines and school procedures that enable and use time well for teachers. As we're all aware, teachers are incredibly busy people. And if we don't get that right, they're the first to tell us. So we have to take that on board. But if we set those routines up, those timetables up and those schedules, we're good. We need time for collaboration, and we need time for collaboration at every different level of the school. And that's a two-way thing. It feeds, that feedback from that collaboration goes up and down and around. It's very much enmeshed in what we do. We need to look at our resources. So have we got the people to do these things that we want to do? Have we got the environment that contributes to our culture? So one of the things that we deliberately do in our space is our shared teaching space, which we refer to as our conference room, is set up with the books, the articles, to make accessing that research really easy for our teachers. They don't have to go out of their way. And it doubles for us as leadership, because we get to curate that research that is on display that they can reach out for when they are going, oh, my student learning data, there's an issue here. They just grab this, have a look at it. And then they've got those routines to go back into their systems, their meetings, and they can facilitate that. We plan for success, we plan for progress. So in those schedules, we have regular timed check-ins. We check in with each other relentlessly, and we hold each other accountable to our responsibility relentlessly, with a smile on our face, of course. So that way, there's no slippage. We can't afford for that slippage. There are definitely times where teachers have gone, oh my gosh, I'm just so tired. But it gets a bit like exercise. Nobody really wants to go out and exercise when they're tired. But when they do, they get that reinvigorating, that energizing extra bit of energy to go forward with. So we're pretty relentless in keeping that. I think the other thing that we need to do is remember to celebrate our growth, because the celebration gives us both the cognitive and the emotional buy-in from our teachers, and that just keeps that energizing going too. So it's like eat, sleep, repeat. So we go in, we look at our evidence, we figure out what we need to learn, we go and apply what we need to learn, we go back into our teams and have a reflect on our impact. We put our head up and we do it all over again. Eat, sleep, repeat.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kathy. A lot of really practical suggestions there. And I love the analogy of comparing it to exercise. I think that's really helpful. One of the GEMS findings was similar to what Kathy talked about just then in terms of those routines, organisational structures, process, how important they are in terms of sustaining evidence use and research use. Makes it a lot easier to do it on an ongoing basis if they're embedded into standard school routines and processes. I'm going to take a moment to encourage everyone at the moment to keep using the chat. I love that you're having conversations between each other in the chat. If you have any questions, put them in, and if we get time, we'll address them. If we run out of time, we'll endeavour to respond to them at a later date. We have incorporated some of the questions you've asked as part of registration into what we're going to talk about in the panel sessions. So the next panelist on the list is Jo, who is from the Q project at Monash University. So Jo, your team has just surveyed over 500 educators about research evidence mobilisation in schools. So this is the Q project, which is run by Monash University that I mentioned earlier. A separate project to the Evidence for Learning one, but obviously we share notes every now and then, given they're similar topics. What are educators telling you about what it means to use research well in schools?
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks for having me tonight. It's fabulous to be here. So hi to everyone. Look, overall, our Q educators are telling us that using research well is really important to them. It matters, yeah. They really believe in the value of using research, and they believe in its potential to improve student outcomes, as well as their own knowledge and professionalism. Several key characteristics of using research well emerged though, and they came up over and over again. And, you know, following here from Simon and Kathy, many of the things that they've already raised were really prominent in the characteristics that our educators thought were really important. So for research use to be meaningful, firstly, our educators told us that there needed to be a clear purpose and intent for using the research. Natalie Izakov, I hope I've pronounced that right, in the chat just now said that, you know, for research to be used meaningfully, it needed to be relevant to context. And our educators told us that repeatedly. It needed to be contextually relevant, but it also needed to be practical. It needed to reflect teacher voice. It needed to be consumable and usable. So that if that wasn't in place, then research use couldn't be meaningful. It couldn't be thoughtful. But to Kathy's point, an investment of time and effort is critically important. Without time and without the effort to make sense of research slowly, deeply, meaningfully, these were some of the adjectives that our educators used, then it wasn't using research well. Another thing, and certainly Kathy and Simon spoke about this, was the need for research to be embedded into processes, into meetings, into activities, into, as Kathy said, the routines of the school. And I know that this is one of the challenges, Danielle, that you've put out in your GEMS insight paper, is for school leaders to really think about and consider how well research use is embedded into the school infrastructure. And that's certainly a key characteristic that has come out from our educators. It needed to be embedded into whether formal or informal, any type of professional learning experience that the teachers were having. So without that, and without that link then back to performance goals, school performance plans, even the vision and values of the school, then our educators were telling us that that wasn't representative of using research well. And last thing, and again, Kathy, you've just nailed it. It's this whole concept of working together to use research. Teachers and school leaders really look to each other across every aspect of using research, whether that's finding it, making sense of it, adapting it for context, trialing it, evaluating it, reflecting on it. Teachers and school leaders want to do that together, and any opportunities that they have to collaborate or network or learn from other people, even just discuss it informally, that contributes to using research well. And probably, I love, Kathy, your we eat, sleep, repeat. We had one school leader who actually said, you know we use research well, or we think we use research well, because it's in everything we do. It's in the way we talk. It's even in the way we breathe. And I loved that comment from one of our school leaders. And I think it just captures exactly the spirit of what you were talking about. Probably the last comment that I wanted to make was, we found one of our key findings was that when these enablers were in place, a clear purpose for using research, investments in time, infrastructure, support and resources, a research engaged culture, and then opportunities for collaborative use, we've got the data that says that educators not only self-report higher levels of confidence in their abilities to use research, but they also self-report more frequent use of research. So I think that's evidence that these things are important, and they contribute to using research well.
Thanks so much, Jo. It's really interesting. It's important to have different research use projects going on in schools around Australia. And it's interesting that there's some definitely emerging themes across them, which just helps, which will help inform the space going forward. I'm going to push on now to the next panel. The topic for the next panel is going to be embedding research evidence use into school improvement processes. So we're going to push a little bit harder on this theme of what it looks like to use research evidence in schools. The GEMS project found that evidence mobilisation does not exist in a vacuum, but operates in the context of the school's goals, plans, structures, processes, including school improvement processes. I think we've heard that already. And again, that those supportive school structures and environments are strong enablers of evidence mobilisation, both in the short term and then evidence mobilisation in the long term. So there's many different school improvement cycles. They basically follow a variation of plan, do, study, act. I mean, Victoria, you've got FISO improvement cycle. Evidence for Learning has one that contains 4 stages called explore, prepare, deliver and sustain. Similar, slight differences. We've mapped the Evidence for Learning implementation cycle to examples of how you can use research in each of those stages. So to give you a taster of that, because the slide's pretty small, but it is all available in the GEMS Insights paper and reflection tools. Basically, you can use research evidence to explore a problem based on what has and hasn't worked before, like what you might want to do, what you may not want to do. You can use research evidence to help create a clear implementation plan, including critical components of an intervention. So it's to help inform that decision making, help crystallize plans, help narrow down a problem or a project that you want to work on. So let's get stuck into it. So this is about a 15-20-minute conversation about how schools can embed research evidence into their school improvement processes. We'll switch up the panelists again. So I'm going to kick off by asking Peter. So as part of your work at Ed Partnerships International, you help schools embed research evidence and student data into your leading maths approach. Can you describe what that process or approach looks like, particularly how schools you work with use that research evidence to enhance what they do?
I'd probably like to begin by quoting that prototypical action researcher, Alice in Wonderland. And this is really the kind of the goal, the end point, I suppose, of what we're trying to do. It's no good going back to yesterday. I was a different person then. And we think that that's the transformative possibility of evidence use in schools. We think there are 2 kind of main types of evidence. There's the externally validated research that comes from all of those special places that Danielle was pointing to earlier. They're from tremendously reliable sources. But then we also have internally validated research, and that's the research and evidence that schools generate themselves. And for us, the line that draws it all together is that it needs to be contextualized. And so one of our roles, I guess, is, and I think Kathy mentioned this earlier, the idea of being a curator. So we're steeped in the research ourselves. We spend a lot of time reading and thinking about the research. We work with a lot of researchers like Peter Sullivan and Doug Clark and Charles Lovett and a whole heap of colleagues at Deakin and Monash and Australian Catholic University. And so one of our roles is to really try and curate those ideas, resources, research for very busy people in schools, and also to help them to slow down in engaging with it. So I was interested to hear Joe talk about the idea of what really works is going slowly and going deeply. And a bit of a mantra for us is this idea of slowing down to go deeper. And so we design tools and processes and resources which support school teams to analyze and make sense of the research that they're engaged with slowly, collaboratively, collegially. And we think that that's really important for mobilizing and, in Danielle's language, getting evidence moving in schools. So we offer processes and analytical scaffolds that help schools to make sense of what they're reading and engaging with from the research. We also, though, think it's critical that this research is contextualized and that it's in the space of their own research. So the two bodies of research sit alongside one another. And that means that we have to help schools, teams in schools, to develop and use research methods and analytical processes that are, in the same way that they are in a research setting, they're kind of tentative. So we use research as a set of clues to investigate and follow through. And this means equipping schools with a whole range of different methods for engaging in their own contexts. So that means developing toolkits to undertake a rich context analysis. Things like what we call a pedagogical crosswalk survey, so that there's an opportunity for schools to weigh up sources of evidence from both their students and from teachers. I think it's also important that research needs to be acted on. And so for the work that we do, it's taking that contextualized research and then applying it in your own context and setting. And through a cycle of coming back and engaging in dialogue and reflection and making sense of that evidence with colleagues, it's embedded into everyday practice. I think the other thing that Kathy mentioned, and it's been a theme so far tonight as well, is this idea of time. And we see it as the primary currency in schools. So we recognize what matters in a school by how much time they devote to it, how much time is privileged and set aside for working on particular things. Now, this is one of the great challenges that schools face, and I think that came through in what Kathy was talking about. There's so much enormous pressure to keep going, to be going faster and faster. But we know that in order to make sense of things, we actually need to slow down. So we try to support schools and school teams to slow down. So that means that we're kind of wandering away from Danielle's primary point, which is the idea of evidence coming from these academic sources. We reckon that it needs to be balanced up with evidence that comes from within a school. That's probably all I have to say, Danielle.
Thanks for that, Peter. We definitely agree with that overall. And there's examples in the GEMS schools of how they combine the research evidence use with student data, obviously through Ed Partnerships International, but also the other professional learning providers that combining the student data and that practitioner generated evidence. We particularly focus the research on research evidence use because there's less information and study out there, but that's definitely not to say that both aren't important. And you'll see when in the GEMS Insights papers, when it comes to evaluating research evidence use, there's a strong role for locally generated data in that space. Thank you very much for sharing all that, Peter. I'm loving the connections and the resources that are being shared in the chat. So please do continue to do that. It's great to have that two channels going at the same time. I'm going to jump to Simon again now before we head to Caroline, just because Simon was another professional learning provider in the GEMS project. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about your approach about embedding research evidence in school improvement processes, Simon, through the work you do with teaching sprints and the work you did as part of GEMS. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned about that process by using it in schools over many years?
Yeah, thanks. And, this didn't come from a research project. It actually emerged to some work I was doing in Alberta around school improvement. And over again, the school leaders there were saying, we keep hearing about, collaborative professional learning processes and PLCs and long form inquiry, but they don't work for anyone but our volunteers. And I said, oh, well, I'm not really in the teacher learning space. I'm more in policy and leadership, but let's dig in and have a look at this. And I think it came really from a pragmatic lens, or what my colleague Tony Loughlin always focuses on, about the viability of this. And I had a mantra, and we had a team of people looking at this, and we just said, if it doesn't work for teachers, it doesn't work. And that means that, yes, time matters and overload matters. And then you have to design around it as a fundamental principle that we probably aren't getting a lot more time, but even more so, it's the mental bandwidth and cognitive load that teachers are enduring in each and every day. And so when they get together in that collaborative time, we need to design around that. These are highly able professionals who are open to engaging in this way, but they might have just taught a 5-period day. They might have just been trying to get their class into school before we were in lockdown and been caught by some millennial parent who just wanted to let them know that their kid is really doing well in mathematics and what next. And so it's in that context that we said, let's take the collaboration, professional learning time they've already got. And then let's say, how can we maximize the benefit of that? We've learned a couple of things. The first thing is to say that we should focus on tiny changes. That we were finding when a lot of teachers were getting lost in sort of 8, 9, 10 steps inquiry cycles, they were comprehensive, they were compelling, but they weren't all that viable for many of our people most of the time, unless they were somehow engage in some long-term additional program. But when we're going for 100% of teachers, they'd lose their way a few terms in. They said, where are we up to? Which step was this? And was that our hunch? And what was our challenge of practice? And so we've learned actually working in shorter cycles of working on tiny, meaningful shifts, what we just call tiny shifts. And that's why we adopted the sprints language. I have a love-hate relationship with it, Danny, I'll tell you. But what I was trying to get at is work on something small, manageable, where you'd actually progress one small area. You're trying to engage with the research literature. Then what you're trying to do is you engage with it and you consider it. You're trying to actually build it in to your ongoing repertoire of teaching. So we've learned about needing to focus often on shorter cycle work, because we struggled, if you want 100% of people to do this work, multi-term work. So we were running about 4 to 5 week cycles. Number two, we've realized that as much as we thought that curating lists of research that was translated was sufficient, it wasn't. We had to come back to that mantra. If it doesn't work with teachers, and I'm going to keep saying, not the volunteer teachers. Anyone can run a long-term inquiry process with the volunteers. We're looking for 100%. And so we learned that we had to keep working hard and creating even easier bite-sized approaches. And so we ended up creating what we call starters out of the GEMS project, getting down to 4 to 5 minute videos with Dylan William and Thomas Sherrington, others, just getting people started, not because we think that's the end point of research engagement, but it's a really good way to build their interest, have some quick wins, make some progress. And then we think that that interest and that culture of research use builds over time rather than necessarily being front-ended. And then lastly, we realized that we didn't have enough discourse about practice, what the research literature and expertise calls deliberate practice. It's hard to do deliberate practice exactly in a complex classroom setting. We talk about that intentional practicing. But this idea of research use needing to move from the cognitive knowledge building and engagement towards working out how to make what works work in your context and integrate that within your ongoing teaching repertoire. So I think that's really what we've been trying to solve collectively as hundreds of schools trying to do this. And so we got it down to a 3-step process because, again, if you don't want to work with just the volunteers, it needs to be simple to remember. Shorter cycles that could build on each other, and then giving people a really easy way in, quick wins built on the behavioral sciences. Of course, later on, once they have a few cycles that work well, they can deepen that engagement and learning. And there's some of the things we've learnt by making more mistakes than most people in the field.
Thanks, Simon. I always appreciate your honesty and deep reflection about where you are and what you are learning, which made you a great partner on this GEMS project. I'm going to quickly throw to Carolyn now. I mean, we could keep this panel going for hours, but we won't keep you on Zoom all night. So we're going to speed up a little bit if we can. So Carolyn works across a number of schools to support them on student learning and engagement. What are some of your reflections on school improvement processes and research evidence use, Carolyn? And in particular, we've got a few questions about this in terms of the registrations. How do you support schools to determine whether they're having an impact? And what kind of support do you think schools need from an education department to help them do this?
Okay, thanks, Danielle. Well, there's sort of 3 questions in one, so I'm
There
not sure I'm going
I'm
to.
throwing you a few there.
I'm not
saving the best for last.
So really, look, as Simon was speaking, you know, I got very excited because we're actually looking at the rapid action cycles and looking at the little tasks that people can do to move forward. So that will come up a little bit later. But in relation to school improvement processes and research use, when I think of school improvement, it covers everything, you know, as was mentioned before, from the leadership team, whole school improvement to actually what happens in the classroom and beyond into the community. We're really lucky in the system that we work in, and I can only speak about Victoria, in that the department actually provides a lot of research evidence-based support in the form of funded initiatives and frameworks, resources, tools, and professional learning. And people like me who work with, you know, a number of schools to support them. So generally, schools have got access to an evidence base that relates to all aspects of school improvement, and that saves leaders and teachers from all of that endless searching for research. And it can also, I guess, ignite discussion before schools understand what challenges they're trying to solve. They can look at research and start thinking and getting insights. Kathy mentioned before the importance of having research available for teachers so that they didn't have to go through or waste a lot of time searching. So curating the research is something that the department does really well. What I found going across, I'm working predominantly with 13 secondary and primary secondary schools. Each of them has a different culture around professional learning, and that seems to determine the consistency of using research to inform either strategies used or processes. What I am seeing, and something that's changed a lot in the last 10 years, is the demand from middle leaders and teachers for research that's linked to teacher practice and specific learning areas. So they're constantly asking me for research around really specific problems that they've identified in the school. That wasn't the case 10 years ago when I was a teaching and learning coach. So it's normal now to include research in any pre-work for communities of practice, and then delve into the connections and work through protocols to get people to really explore the research. And again, Joe mentioned before the need for professional learning to connect to research evidence. In supporting schools, I need to be able to provide high quality research evidence if I'm asked for it, and even if I'm not asked for it, where I see the need for it. I'm specifically working in literacy and numeracy and in school leadership in some cases, and it's important for me to be able to share and at times facilitate discussions that connect the school context and lead to the next steps. So
I think modelling those discussions around the research is really, really important. The research evidence can help teachers and middle leaders also influence leadership teams and school improvement teams. And that's where I've also pointed towards research where middle leaders have wanted to, I guess, implement a strategy, but need to, and they've looked at the research, but they need to be able to convince others that that's the right way to go. The necessity for the research, I think, comes from the inquiry cycles in schools, and that's really related to the culture, the processes and the structures. And this is where Kathy's eat, sleep, repeat comes into play. If that isn't the norm in a school, then yeah, that's something that needs to be worked on. Going back to supporting schools to determine whether they're having an impact, in my conversations with individual schools in the initiatives that I'm supporting them with, revolve around asking what they're focusing on and what the students need. How do they know? So the assessment that they're using, what strategies they're using, and why and how they know that they're having an impact, or why the strategies are being chosen and how they know they're having an impact, what data sources they're using, going back to what was said before about multiple sources of data. And specifically, we're looking at not only achievement data, but engagement, attendance, wellbeing data as well. And then what else do you need to know and how are you going to find out? So considering all of that really before pinpointing the problems that need to be solved and then the research that needs to be accessed is really important. You talked about, I think you asked me around how I support schools to monitor their impact. Really, each school monitors differently, and depending on student goals and assessment considerations, the documentation is also different, but it isn't me telling them how to monitor. It's really about them engaging in the regular reflection on the strategies they're using, and if they're not having an impact, to actually change the strategies and document as they go. I've been heavily involved in individual education plans for students, so they can be really valuable in helping schools monitor their impact. Are students achieving their goals? And they're very short, often very short-term goals, and then we move on to another goal if students have achieved the first goal. As far as the system supporting schools, I mentioned before, lots of the heavy lifting's being done already with access to research and things like initiatives and so on based on research evidence. The one thing that the system is doing well and needs to do more of is providing case studies and guidance around applying the research in a classroom, in a school improvement team. So connecting it all. Teachers and teams that I work with ask me constantly, what are other schools doing? What does this look like in another school? So those case studies and being able to see research in practice is vital. Co-constructing and co-designing policy and professional learning with educators is something that the system does well and needs to keep doing. And continuing to have people on the ground to facilitate the conversations and to really encourage those short inquiry cycles and bringing research into those cycles is something that is really important. So absolutely. I guess finally the work of the system is to make sure the reflective practice becomes business as usual. So we've got some sustainability, and research evidence is just something normal that's used.
Yeah, absolutely. I would concur with that, Carolyn. I'm going to keep pushing on just because we are rapidly running out of time. Mark, I wanted to go to you now in terms of that exact question about sustaining research evidence use in schools. So you've done a lot of research as part of the Q project. So I'm particularly interested in what you're finding out about things like leadership, culture, infrastructure, or anything else that hasn't come up in our conversation yet this evening that you have seen with all the work that you're doing.
Sure, Danielle, and great to be here. And I know time's short, so I'm going to make 3 quick points. We went out to 500 educators across Australia and asked them about what does using research well look like in schools. And 6 characteristics came out as really important. I'm just going to pick on 3 because I think they make a helpful connection to this issue of sustaining research use within schools. The first one was very clear, and Joe's mentioned this already, that it needs to be purposeful. And that won't come as any surprise to anyone, but I think there's something important. What that means is that it's kind of driven by something internal, i.e. an improvement priority, a problem of practice that we own and we care about, as opposed to an external shiny idea that was mentioned by Simon and others earlier on. And I think this is similar to the kind of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation in terms of sustaining something. I think there's something significant in there around the fact that if something is internally purposeful as opposed to externally attractive. That's one. A second point, which has come up again, I mean, Kathy mentioned it earlier, building collaboration in at every level, but it's collective. If research use is a collective effort rather than an individual activity, either on the part of senior leaders or on the part of individual classroom teachers, then there's greater possibility for sustaining it because it's more of a team sport as opposed to an individual. And then something embedded, that's come up again already, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that if things are built into the powerful improvement processes that we've got within our school, they're much more likely to be purposeful, they're more likely to be shared, and therefore they're more likely to be sustainable. So I'll leave it at that, Danielle, because I know time's short, but those are 3 thoughts.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful to have those 3 very succinct thoughts, much appreciated. It's one of the things I love about working with you, and you can clearly get succinct points across. Now I'm going to finish with one question. I want to go back to Kathy, then we're going to have a bit of a wrap up. But Kathy, I just wanted you to spend a little bit of time talking about how you've worked with professional learning providers to help you mobilise research evidence in your school. It was one of the kind of unique features of the GEMS project that the evidence was mobilised through professional learning providers. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, about how providers have helped you identify and access relevant and rigorous research evidence.
We worked with Training 24/7 and Simon with the teaching sprints, and they have both given us something very different and very valuable. The Training 24/7 was the trainers that came in and they specifically worked with our kindergarten and our year 1 leaders in specifically phonics instructions. So it was a very fine point. So again, we wanted to go really deep there. We didn't just want to go surface level. We targeted the school leaders in the professional learning part of it, so we could basically build and embed that really deep expertise into our school staff. So we wanted that expert sitting inside our staff so we can, in the future, and we have, sort of used her expertise to mobilise other collective learning across the teams. So she worked with the professional provider there, and she worked mainly in demonstration lessons, observations, feedbacks. So it was a very triangulated process with lots of discussion on what the impact of her work was. And at the same time, there was lots of discussion on pretty like Willingham and work like that, specifically around language acquisition. So it was the pedagogical level wasn't really what you would expect our first year or second year out kindergarten teachers to have to deal with, but it was driven into our classroom practice by our instructional leader who mediated that process between our provider and our teams. And that was what we wanted. Teaching sprints, we worked initially with Simon as a whole leadership team. So we've got a big leadership team, but we wanted everybody to understand what the process was We wanted to understand when and how to use the protocols and tools that came with it, because the protocols and tools were ways of really using that research evidence well. So not just using it, but using it well. So we wanted to see that happen. We wanted that also in those tools embedded in our systems. I think keeping with the research for us was that the research had to be transferable into our practice. Teaching sprints allowed us to have that collaboration, that teamwork, and we would take an umbrella of a concept, we would break it down. So initially, and sorry, I know we're running out of time, it was cognitive science, our big picture, our big idea, and then we broke it down. And as Simon said earlier, it's those little incremental chunks, but those little incremental chunks of improvement allowed us to differentiate the professional learning of every teacher. So
Kathy, I think you just jumped on mute there, but I might have to wrap up there anyway. I'm sorry to cut you off. Did you want to quickly?
Oh, that's all right.
10 seconds, because we're right on time.
No.
And I want to wrap everyone up on time. Just quickly, so you know, we've had a few requests in the chat to share the chat. We will try to compile some of those resources and send them out in an email after this, because I know there's a lot of resources in the chat and we won't send people's actual comments, but if you've shared a resource, we'll share them out. We've run out of time for questions, unfortunately, but I know Joe and others have answered people's questions in the chat, so thank you very much for doing that. There was a series of writing questions that we haven't had a chance to unpack tonight, but in the slide deck, which we also share, as well as the recording free on the E4L website, I've pointed to some resources to answer some of those things that we haven't had a chance to talk about this evening in detail. Simon's also shared some of the Teaching Sprints resources, as have the Q Project team, as have others. There's the links to all the other resources mentioned. Feel free to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can get in touch with me if you have a follow-up question. That's it. I just want to say a very big thank you to all our panelists for giving up their time with everything else they've got going on. And to sign off finally, yes, slides will be available. The resources in the chat will be available. Everything mentioned on the slides will be available, so you can access it all. I hope everyone has a good and a safe evening and a rest of their week. Thanks again, everyone.